We've talked about the American NES experience for those few lucky gamers who picked up the console during its initial launch window during the 1985 holiday shopping season. Now let's look briefly at the Japanese equivalent, the first 6 months of the family computer's existence. The Famicom and NES's early days weren't all that different when it comes down to it. In both Japan and the US, Nintendo had very little clout in the console market, and both the Famicom and NES debuted in near anonymity compared to the hype that would surround subsequent Nintendo product launches. In both markets, the console's initial lineups consisted entirely of Nintendo first-party releases. They were not, however, the same releases. Of the 16 games confirmed to have appeared on NES in 1985, and the 9 titles Nintendo launched for Famicom in 1983, the system shared only one release, Baseball, in common. To a certain degree, that was a function of timing. Debuting 2 years later than Famicom, the NES's tardiness allowed Nintendo of America to cherry-pick games that would appear more impressive than anything published in Japan during 1983, Super Mario Bros., for example. But in many cases, the differences boiled down to cultural differences. Comparing and contrasting the different launch lineups Nintendo went with in its 2 main territories offers an interesting study in priorities and marketing. Mario sells, an immutable truth of video games and a cornerstone of Nintendo's business. Mario launched the company to international acclaim with Super Mario Bros., sold the world on 3D graphics with Super Mario 64, and helped demonstrate that portable games could be every bit as rich and involving as their console counterparts with Super Mario Land. Before any of those games could happen, though, Nintendo had to create Donkey Kong. The arcade game's stunning success took Nintendo from coin-op nobody to major superpower. So it's little surprise that the family computer hardware, for which initial design work began in 1981, right as Donkey Kong began its crusade to devour quarters, was purpose-built to offer consumers the best possible home rendition of the game. Space Invaders and Pac-Man were easy enough to recreate on home hardware, despite Atari's infamous failure with the latter, but the more complex Donkey Kong proved trickier. Nintendo's big sales pitch for its home console's Japanese launch was that it offered the closest thing available to a perfect port of the arcade smash. It wasn't truly perfect. It dropped the cement factory level that developers omitted from all but a handful of computer versions, it lacked the opening cinema scenes, and it had very slightly squashed vertical proportions. But even with these changes, it looked, sounded, and controlled more accurately than any port before it. Unfortunately for Nintendo, even a stunning rendition of Donkey Kong seemed fairly old hat by 1983. The Famicom would need to brew for a while before it truly became the phenomenon Nintendo dreamed of. Donkey Kong's follow-up lacked the perfect punch of the original game. Junior just couldn't live up to the standards set by his old man. It's a fascinating parallel to the strained relationship between Nintendo boss Hiroshi Yamauchi and his son-in-law, former Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa, whom Yamauchi pointedly passed over for succession upon his own retirement in favor of the guy who programmed Golf and Balloon Fight. Donkey Kong Jr. is only so-so as a video game. Ironically, Donkey Kong Jr. would see a far more exacting Famicom port than its superior predecessor. Unlike the first Donkey Kong, Jr. contains all 4 of the arcade stages. Its visuals looked every bit as faithful, and the change in its screen dimensions weren't as noticeable. But that speaks, to some degree, to the failings of the underlying game. For instance, Jr. could contain all 4 arcade stages because those levels were less diverse and unique than the ones that comprised Donkey Kong, and therefore required less memory. But even if Jr. does fall flat in the wake of its legacy, the Famicom launch couldn't have been complete without it. Nintendo led with 3 games in July 1983, its 3 biggest arcade hits to date. Nintendo was more than happy to skip over its flops. There was little room within that tiny launch lineup for the likes of Radar Scope or Sky Skipper. Maybe Jr. hadn't quite hit the same heights as Donkey Kong, but it still had fared quite well in the arcades, and it still used Donkey Kong as its underpinnings, to the point of inspiring a lawsuit, in fact. This conversion more than did the coin-op justice, and it made a natural complement to the Famicom's must-have launch title. If you were grabbing Donkey Kong with your new console, it only made sense to pick up the sequel, right? Donkey Kong and its sequel enjoyed fantastic conversions on Famicom, but Nintendo's third and final Day One arcade port fared more poorly. The Popeye coin-op represented a significant technical improvement over Donkey Kong, with huge, bold sprites, and the console lacked the oomph, or perhaps Nintendo's programmers simply lacked sufficient understanding of the hardware, to reproduce those cartoonish characters on that tiny cart, which was molded in spinach green, of course, as with all of Nintendo's Popeye Game & Watch creations. Alas, this makes Popeye for Famicom something of a letdown. Much like Donkey Kong Jr., this platformer builds on the framework of Donkey Kong, but lacks its brilliant design. Much of the arcade version's appeal came from the marvelously detailed character sprites, which faithfully depicted the cartoon characters. Bereft of that visual hook, the game loses something vital. It's okay, but it feels weaker, like Popeye denied his spinach fix. Despite the graphical downgrade, it still manages to capture the essence of the arcade title: the multi-tiered stages, the unpredictable behavior of Bluto, who, ruffian that he is, ignores the rules of platform game design and attacks across floors, and the heart-catching intensity of play. Popeye does have one notable distinction to its name, though. It's the first Famicom release never to be ported to or reproduced on another system. After this, a port appeared on NES early in the console's US and European careers. The video game rights to Popeye evidently passed to another publisher, namely Sigma, who published 2 Popeye titles for Game Boy. Nintendo would learn its lesson about expired licensing, though. 1987's excellent Doki Doki Panic, created for Fuji TV, would later be reworked with new sprites to become a permanent part of the Mario pantheon. Nintendo followed up its trio of Famicom arcade game conversions with something far less kid-friendly: 2 conversions of popular Japanese tabletop games. Over the years, this has proven to be something of a standard for Japanese consoles. You'll find a version of Go or MAHJONG right near launch, perhaps as a peace offering to older players. Or perhaps out of some sense of tradition that began here. The presence of Gomoku Narabe Renju, a variant on Go, roughly the Japanese equivalent of chess, probably shouldn't be a surprise coming from Nintendo. The company's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, was a high-level Go player. Though he reputedly prided himself on never having played video games, it's not too difficult to imagine him giving this one at least a cursory try, if only to declare the AI inadequate against someone of his skill level. But this too was ultimately a Nintendo arcade conversion of sorts. One of the company's first coin-op creations in the 70s was a cocktail cabinet-style adaptation of Othello, itself a simplified adaptation of the Go concept, more commonly known as Reversi. Computer Othello made its way home as one of Nintendo's standalone TV game systems in 1980, retailing for a hefty 48,000 yen, according to the blog Before Mario. It's easy then to understand why Nintendo was eager to switch to interchangeable cartridges. The Famicom debuted at 14,800 yen, and carts for around 4,000 yen apiece. Gomoku Narabe Renju offered a more complex rendition of the dedicated Othello console Nintendo had sold a few years prior, yet combined with the Famicom hardware itself, still came in at less than half the price. And the system could also play a mean game of Donkey Kong. Where there's Japanese consoles, there's MAHJONG games. Adopted and adapted from the Chinese tabletop game, Japanese MAHJONG uses its own specific rules. And more importantly for the purposes of Famicom gaming, it offers a great opportunity for multiplayer gaming gathered around a TV, which has always been a crucial feature for Nintendo. This first attempt at recreating the tabletop experience didn't actually offer that feature though, but everyone has to start somewhere. Unlike every other 1983 Famicom release, MAHJONG isn't adapted from a previous Nintendo game. The company would begin selling a deluxe MAHJONG Game & Watch device called Yakuman a few months after this game's debut, a dedicated handheld that at 16,800 yen cost nearly as much as a Famicom and a copy of MAHJONG. The Famicom game featured color graphics, but the monochrome Yakuman portable justified its cost. Up to 4 people could play together by link cable, as in real MAHJONG. Famicom MAHJONG, on the other hand, was strictly a single-player experience. Not only that, but it only included play against a single computer opponent. Presumably memory or processing constraints made a full, proper game impossible. Nintendo would eventually rectify this wrong, sort of, by publishing Hudson's Yonnin Uchi Mahjong, or 4-person strike Mahjong, a year later. It didn't allow 4 people to play, but it did add 2 additional AI opponents for a proper man versus machine hand of Mahjong. This limitation didn't seem to hurt the first Mahjong's prospects at retail, though. It was reportedly the third best-selling Famicom title released in 1983. Like a lot of early Famicom software, the sheer novelty of its existence more than made up for any design inadequacies. Where Donkey Kong was slightly too old to be a true killer app for Famicom, and Donkey Kong Jr. and Popeye too lacking as concepts, Mario Bros. Made a far more compelling sales pitch. Arriving on Famicom a mere 3 months after its coin-op debut, Mario Bros. Truly felt like a make-good on the elusive promise every console maker proclaimed: a fresh, current arcade experience at home. Yes, the Famicom release lacked some of the graphical detail of the upright cabinet, but simplified sprites aside, this was the real deal, suffering from very few compromises in its mission to deliver Mario Bros. To home gaming fans. Most importantly, of course, Mario Bros. On Famicom offered the cooperative design of its arcade counterpart. Well, perhaps cooperative is a misnomer. Better to say simultaneous, as this was the game that established Nintendo's fascination with multiplayer design that allows for both antagonism and friendship, depending on the players, the situation, or the mood. Here, Mario and Luigi face an endless swarm of creatures emerging from a pair of pipes. Players punch the ground from beneath their enemies to upend them and kick them into submission, clearly inspired by Williams' hit Joust, and not the last Nintendo creation to draw on that work. Those ground-pounding tactics work just as well to upset the other player as they do the bad guys, interrupting their movements or even causing them to collide with an enemy. Two players working together could achieve high scores. Two players working in conflict were more likely to find high blood pressure. A brilliant bit of game design, brilliantly and quickly converted to Famicom. In the US, Nintendo released its black box NES games under the banner of various series: Sports, Action, Zapper, and yes, even Robot. But there was one series that wasn't a series at all: the Education series, which consisted only of a single game, Donkey Kong Jr. Math. In Japan, Nintendo didn't bother with those groupings on its boxes, but if it had, their Education series would have had a bit more truth in the name. Famicom did in fact receive 2 educational titles, so it had at least as legitimate a claim to the word series as the Robot lineup. Besides Donkey Kong Jr. Math, Famicom also received the oddity that was Popeye no Eigo Asobi, roughly, Popeye's English tutor. Popeye was a strange choice to teach English to Japanese children, given the character's rather tenuous grasp on the language.
Where did those guys go to? Wait till I get them.
But nevertheless, that's who Nintendo went with, most likely because it allowed them to easily repurpose sprites from their Popeye arcade conversion. Players are presented with a Japanese word written in phonetic katakana script and have to spell out the English translation by selecting Roman letters in any order. Incorrect choices cause baby Sweet Pea, hanging precariously from an overhead line, to shift a notch closer to his doom. The game box, now exceedingly rare and expensive, included a 2-sided reference sheet that provides all the game's terms, in both languages, in eye-wateringly tiny agate type. For perhaps obvious reasons, the game was never localized. It probably could have been adapted to teach kids Japanese, but despite America's widespread 80s Japan panic, that language was never as useful or as trendy here as ours was over there. Even so, Popeye works out to be a much better learning game than its math companion, an effective if limited vocabulary drill for both Japanese and English speakers alike. Baseball for Famicom needs no real introduction. It's exactly the same game as the American release that kicked off this series. Almost. Unlike many NES launch titles, baseball actually does include some regional differences. It actually required a small amount of localization, which required a little bit of work for a game of this vintage. The tiny amount of text included in the game had to be hard-coded, requiring new graphics to be drawn up for Roman letters. Meters and kilometers had to be converted to feet and miles. More crucially, Nintendo couldn't simply manufacture a surplus of Japanese ROM chips for baseball and stick them into American carts with an adapter, as was the case for so many games to ship at the NES's soft launch in 1985. That also meant Nintendo had to re-engineer the ROMs themselves. If that seems like a lot of trouble to go to for such a simple sports game, consider the popularity of this particular sport in both Japan and the US. In a time of international distrust, it was a common thread that united our two nations. Nintendo would even end up buying their own American Major League Baseball team. There's a reason that this was the lead sports game for both the Famicom and NES. The fanaticism our countries share for baseball meant it behooved Nintendo to adapt the game for both US and Japanese markets. As a sign of how much more sophisticated this take on baseball was than what had come before, the Japanese release comes with a controls cheat sheet in addition to the standard instruction manual. Again, baseball may not look like much today, but in '83, this was state of the art. Back in the day, Donkey Kong Jr. Math was that one game you only ever saw on the NES lineup posters that came with the games. You certainly didn't know anyone who owned it, and, like Stack Up, you probably never saw it in stores after 1986. It wouldn't be the last edutainment game for NES, but it would be the last from Nintendo, who, between this and Popeye no Eigo ASOBI, paid their obligatory lip service to video games as constructive activities and promptly went back to making software people would actually want to buy. The game's undesirable nature in the 80s makes it a hot property today. The US version of Donkey Kong Jr. Math sells for a pretty penny as a bare cart, and for a horrifying sum complete. The Japanese version isn't quite so scarce, especially bare, but it's just as unloved. Players control Junior as he shuffles up and down vines attempting to complete math sums. Perhaps it's down to personal bias. As a writer, I find words more interesting than numbers, but it doesn't seem nearly as enjoyable a game as Popeye's edutainment bid. The Famicom Education series consists of graphics repurposed from two launch titles, Donkey Kong Jr. and Popeye. So what of the third and most popular launch game? Well, that was to be recycled into something educational as well, Donkey Kong no Ongaku Asobi, a music teaching game. That never saw the light of day, despite having been advertised. Perhaps its creators realized it wasn't much fun without a keyboard, and that the Famicom controller 2 mic kinda sucked for karaoke. Anyway, it was the first cancelled Famicom creation that we know of, which is a shame because it seemed a lot more interesting than this one.